Mistakes were made. Wrinkly bodice, awful back flap, thick puffy waistband, too dark of fabric, weak and cheap organza, stiff frills, collapsing hoop skirt, folly a party Barbie organza, just too much fabric. Yes, in the process of making 5 Cinderella ball gown replicas, mistakes were definitely made. With each dress that I made, I had a previous example of a previous dress to look at and to bask in all of its mistakes. But this is where a mistake turns into a lesson. If we can learn from our mistakes, I don't think mistakes are really such a bad thing. Learning from them is the key though, and if a lesson is learned from, we can grow into a whole new skill level. And this project is no exception. So as much as I look back and see those mistakes, I am not going to approach this video as a mistake-filled video. This is going to be approached as a lesson-filled video, because again, mistakes can be turned into lessons if we let them, and if we learn from them, and if we improve on those lessons that we've learned. And so that is why I am making this video, because it is always better to have a lesson learned by not making the mistake. So welcome to this video. I'm Bella May. I've made 5 Cinderella ball gowns, and I am about to approach my 6th replica, and I am first going to take you along on a trip down memory lane. And let's call this video a learn from my mistakes so you don't have to make them video. Lesson number 1, fit your bodice. And preferably fit your bodice before the photo shoot. Yeah, probably something you already knew, but 15-year-old me didn't know that apparently, because after making the bodice, I tried on the bodice about a day before the photo shoot was planned for my Cinderella ball gown replica, and it didn't fit. Surprise, surprise, it didn't fit, and it was too large. So what did I do to fix this, little 15-year-old me? I just moved the hooks on the bodice. Just moved them. I just moved the hooks. A smaller bodice, what do you know? And the best part about this is I did not trim off that extra flap that no longer was secure to anything. Just move the hooks and that'll fix it, right? No. I had this awful back flap thing through the entire photo shoot. So do you ever wonder why I never post pictures of the back of the dress? Or at least if I do, they're very far away? This is the reason. Every time I see pictures of that back flap thing decision, I kind of, just can't believe I did that. But again, I was 15 and I had never made a ball gown before, never had made a really fit bodice before, and so it was a mistake, but it was a lesson. So that may just seem like a, yeah, you should fit your bodice before that, but it's also a lesson in being too quick. I still struggle with this, I'm still learning it, but to be patient with the process of making something. As much as I like pushing out a project and getting it done quickly, because I'm just so excited about that finished result, I need to slow myself down and take time to really work the whatever I'm working on well. Do it well. And again, I'm still struggling with this, and 15-year-old me was definitely struggling with it. To quickly make something, not try it on, not take the time to try it on and make sure it's fitting right, but just to get it done quickly. You know, that's kind of my mentality. And again, I'm still learning, and that's okay to be still learning something, but I'm here to pass it on to you. It's okay to slow down, take some time. Yes, there's going to be times that you have a deadline that you just can't take away, and you do have to do it quick, but on the times that you don't, take your time. So the lesson learned is take your time on a bodice and preferably fit it several times before the photo shoot, and especially don't try it on for the first time the day before the shoot. Like, what do you know? Yeah, do that. Do it way before. So yeah, that was pretty silly of me, but we've all got those embarrassing lessons that we'd rather not share with anyone. So with sharing that embarrassing story with the world, let's move on to some other valuable lessons. And here's another tip for the bodice. The back of the bodice was of course atrocious, but the front, it wasn't as bad. Well, anything really is better than that back flap. But there's still some wrinkles to the bodice. So this was my first bodice, and I really didn't bone it very well. I had very few bones going along that bodice, and so it just really couldn't keep its shape. And also, this was my first time making a pattern from scratch, and so I really didn't have very much knowledge at all about how things are supposed to fit. So that was rookie mistake number one. But on the next few bodices, I was able to quickly correct these mistakes by adding more boning to the bodice and just make sure I had a really good fit to the bodice. FYI, the skirt for this dress is the same as this one for a customer. I just remade the bodice for her and adjusted the waistbands to her size, and so that's why I don't have my original Cinderella dress lying around in my closet. But I do have the bodice in question that has the nice back flap scenario going on. So there's the second line of hooks that I put on. As you can see, very unevenly spaced and quite atrocious. But yeah, that's scary. And wearing cover up on my back because I had an uneven tan, I think, got all over the bodice. But so mentioning the boning, I didn't have, oh wow, I only had 2 pieces of boning in this, guys. That's why it was so wrinkly. I have 2 front bonings and a back one, and that's it. 3 pieces of bone in this bodice. I have definitely come a long way to fitting a bodice and fitting a very smooth bodice. That was a pretty poor attempt, but again, it was my first time and I learned those lessons, and that's the best part about mistakes. So we'll talk about the bodice more when I actually go to making the bodice, but a huge tip for it is to cut the pattern pieces on a bias. I didn't do this with my first 3 Cinderella dresses, but I did on my last 2, which were my upgraded versions, which I added all the techniques and such that I had learned to be more accurate to the original. But those 2 upgraded, I cut the bodice on a bias, and it really did work wonders. So cutting on a bias is another huge tip to getting a smooth bodice. Lesson number 2, petticoat strength. The strength of the petticoat is incredibly important. Even though you've got lightweight fabric, all the fabric combined does end up having some weight to it. So you've got these lightweight fabrics that are holding up this weight of the frills, but at the same time, that lightweight fabric has to be strong. So the base of the petticoat is where it's incredibly important to add a strong fabric. Don't just use the cheapest of cheap fabric. So I might have done that, the cheapest of the cheap, because I was on a pretty low budget on my first Cinderella dress. I was 15, I had hardly accepted any custom orders before, didn't have a whole lot in the bank account, but I went cheap, and in the end, it was just cheap. With the weight of the frills or a small step of the frills, the cheap, lightweight fabric became a big problem. So this lesson is pretty simple. Don't buy the cheapest of cheap for those reasons as well as ethical reasons. But after learning this lesson, I didn't just go out and buy the most expensive organza out there. I still found a polyester organza that was relatively cheaply priced, but not the cheapest of the cheap. It was still a reasonable price, but it also came from a very reliable source, and the fabric was a good quality fabric. Now, when I'm saying good quality, no, again, it does not mean the most expensive. It just means it has quality when it was made. And you can test this out, and I would highly recommend testing out your base petticoat fabric layers before going and making the dress or the petticoat, because you don't necessarily know how it's going to withstand the weight of the frills, because when you have a seam in this cheap organza, you tug on that seam, it it pulls the fibers of the fabric away from itself, and your seam is now basically hanging on threads. It's really, really bad. But with just a reasonable organza that's found on a reliable source, then the seam, it holds up. It's not gonna just rip apart or stretch apart. It really holds up. And so even just feeling a fabric, you can pretty much tell whether or not it's going to hold up to that seam between the base of the petticoat and the frills. So just be aware of that when finding your organza for the petticoat. So again, don't go with the cheapest of the cheap fabric. It might be incredibly tempting, but in the end, it will not be worth it. Lesson number 3, hoop skirt strength. A collapsing hoop skirt is no fun at all. Once you get the weight of the petticoat on that hoop skirt, the hoop skirt just doesn't want to support the petticoat anymore. It's done. So when choosing your hoop skirt design, you really need to factor a few things in. Before I started making a replica of the original crinoline used in the movie, I had my customers purchase hoop skirts on various online sources. I was kind of like, I'll leave that up to you, find a hoop skirt that can support weight. Now, of course, I did recommend don't get just like a 3 hoop skirt. Get one that has several hoops to help hold out that weight. Now, that did help somewhat, but I had a few customers that hoop skirt would not stand up to the weight of the petticoat. And so they ended up buying 2 hoop skirts and wore them together. And so that seemed to help, just wearing 2 hoop skirts, so double the bones, even though they're right on top of each other, that helped. Even though the many hooped hoop skirt and the double hoop skirt worked for some of them, I still recommend that the best hoop skirt is made of thick steel boning. It is definitely more expensive to go that route, but in the end, I do think it's the best way to keep yourself the headache of a collapsing hoop skirt when all you want to do is twirl in your petticoat. Of course, the other option is to just minimize your petticoat size. Add less layers, add less frills, and thus you'd have less weight on your hoop skirt, and that would solve the whole problem. But for those of us who really want to get the most accurate to the original dress as possible, eliminating frills is not an option. So for those of you who don't really see that as an option, let's look at a couple things that might help along the process of making a hoop skirt and a petticoat that won't collapse the hoop skirt. So before we go on to looking at that replica hoop skirt that I made, one thing must be noted. I made this replica hoop skirt or crinoline for the upgraded versions of my dress. I made 2 upgraded versions of my Cinderella dress. They were the versions that I spent more time and money on for the customers because they paid for it, and I was able to add in more details and supplies than my other ones. But that upgraded petticoat actually had much more weight to it than my non-upgraded petticoat. And so I still had a problem with the collapsing hoop. So you probably are wondering, why was your upgraded petticoat, which should have been more accurate to the original and thus more lightweight, why was it heavier than your non-upgraded petticoat? We're going to talk about that in the next lesson, but for the purpose of this hoop skirt lesson, my petticoat was heavier. And so even though I had a replica hoop skirt design based on the one used in the movie, and it was made out of steel boning, because of the extra weight of the petticoat, my hoop skirt was still collapsing. Those lower few hoops, they were just collapsing under the weight of the petticoat. And so there's 2 things I did. One was I adjusted the petticoat design slightly, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. But the other thing was I put a second piece of boning, steel boning, through all those lower hoops. So it was kind of tight, squeezing another thick piece of boning in those boning channels, but I did get it in and it did help solve the problem. So yes, it did add quite a lot of extra supplies to that hoop skirt, and I ended up making not very much money on it, but it helped solve the problem. And that, as a person who wants to provide the best quality to someone, I sometimes limited my own income to make sure that that dress and whatever I was making for it lived up to the standard. And so that can be a demise of a perfectionist making costumes for people. But anyway, back to the hoop skirt. Putting that double thick piece of boning did help. So this lesson, make sure you really focus on the hoop skirt. This is one of those foundational pieces that you don't want to skimp on. As with pretty much all of foundation things, you don't want to skip on those things because they are the things that support the outer dress. And if you compromise on those, your outer dress will also be compromised. So make sure you focus on getting a strong hoop skirt, one preferably made of steel boning, or if you're making your own, make sure you bone it very well. So we already talked about Petticoat Strength and the fabric used in it, but the next one is Petticoat Construction, because that will help with the whole hoop skirt problem as well. Lesson number 4, Petticoat Construction. So as I mentioned, my upgraded petticoat design was much heavier than my non-upgraded petticoat. So before we go and explore that, let's first look at my non-upgraded original petticoat design. So here's a sketch of my original petticoat design. I have a base layer to the petticoat, and then coming off that, I have all the other layers of the petticoat, and attached to all of those are the frills. And so overall, it was a very lightweight construction. I have organza making up the layers of the petticoat, including the base layer, and the frills are made of organza as well, and also tulle. So all around, very lightweight material. So now let's look at my petticoat construction for the upgraded version. So I have this first layer, and then I have a layer of godettes. I pronounced that incorrectly last time, and then even though I thought I was pronouncing it correctly, someone said, since it's a French word, that it would actually be godet. I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, but I like the sound of godet better than godette or godet. Maybe it's godet. But anyway, godets, which sounds much better. So I had a layer of godets on that, and then on the same layer, I had a second tier of godets. So no visible problems. But now let's look at the next layer of the petticoat. On here again, I have a base skirt layer, and then on it, another layer of godets. But this time, I'm using chiffon fabric for these godet layers. That's where the problem comes in. If you've worked with chiffon before, you might have noticed how heavy it is. Even though it has a really lovely flow and it looks kind of weightless, or it just has a really pretty flow. So it has that really nice flow, but when you go to work with it and feel it, and especially yards and yards of it, you realize the weight of it. It's a very heavy fabric. So now we have a small problem because of those godet layers being made of chiffon. The big problem comes with the next layers. At this point in time, the photos of Flick Swan had just come out, and I wanted, of course, to replicate this outer layer to the petticoat. I really liked the way it looked, and if you watched my video about the costume breakdown of the Cinderella dress, you may have noticed that I said some of those layers looked like chiffon, but I was pretty sure it wasn't because of the weight. And this is how I learned that. So I thought it was chiffon, and so I bought chiffon for these layers. I ended up making 2 full-length layers for this petticoat. 2 waist to floor layers with frills attached on the bottom of chiffon. There were so many yards of chiffon in those 2 layers, I don't even remember, but it was a lot. And so as soon as I put that on, you had so much weight on that petticoat. Weight that the hoop skirt just couldn't support, and it thus collapsed. So 2 full layers of chiffon, talk about adding a lot of weight. So on top of those chiffon fabric layers, I also added some chiffon frills mixed in to all the frills because I thought that would add a nice texture. But again, that added weight. So you probably found a theme here. Chiffon is no good for this dress. It's a lovely fabric, but I'm afraid it is not invited to this party. So with all that chiffon added, I needed to reduce those layers because I could not have that weight, and the weight was collapsing the hoop skirt, and that was just no good. So I ended up taking off those full layers of the chiffon altogether, just took them off the petticoat and just added some extra frills to my under part of the petticoat. I still had the godet layer made of chiffon, but it didn't matter too much. It was mainly those really long, large outer layers of the petticoat that was causing the problem. So I ended up just taking them off. I did actually use one of those chiffon layers on my next upgraded Cinderella dress, but I just used one of the layers, and by then I had kind of minimized the weight of the rest of the petticoat, and I had made my hoop skirt a bit more structural and more supportive. Again, chiffon, don't use it. Now, I have this video posted of me twirling in the Cinderella petticoat. This was my first upgraded petticoat, and as you can see, it has those chiffon layers. This petticoat has 2 full layers of chiffon on it. Now, you might be thinking, the hoop skirt doesn't look like it's collapsing, it looks fine, right? Well, that's because I'm twirling. You have centrifugal force taking all the weight and distributing the frills basically into the air. And none of the weight is actually on the hoop skirt. Once I stopped twirling, that's where the problems occurred. So lesson learned, use lightweight but strong fabric on your petticoats. Don't use chiffon. It's lovely, but it's not for this dress. Lesson number 6, too many skirt layers. So you know those quotes from Sandy Powell where she mentions 6 layers to the skirt, or one even mentions 12 layers to the skirt. And then there's that quote about all the different colors, like a green, a lilac, a silvery, a pink, a blue. Well, those were the source of some of my problems. When first making my replicas, I thought that those 6 layers and those colors were all in the outer skirt. And so what I did is I layered my top outer fabric of silk organza and my under layer of iridescent nylon type fabric. I put those 2 and then 4 layers of tulle in between. And each of those layers of tulle was a different color. And so I had blue, the iridescent, and the other 4 colors in between. And what I did is I just put them all together and gathered the waistband. Talk about a nightmare of gathering. I had all these layers of fabric all sewn together and gathered together. I was gathering them so tightly to get the correct measurement for the waistband that I was so scared that even though I had 4 lines of stitches gathering them all together, I was just so afraid that they were gonna pop and all my gathering work had just disappeared, which did happen a few times. That was just really bad. Don't do that. So after my first one of doing this, I realized it was not right. The waistband was just too poofy and large and really made the waist measurement larger, because now you have all this fabric gathered up together that creates more waist measurement, and it just was not good. So I knew this was not right. So in my second one, I decided to do 2 gathers. So I did the top 3 fabrics gathered together and then the bottom 3 fabrics gathered together. And then when I put them together, I put the underlayer slightly lower and it dropped it down, the bulk of that waistband. So I just had that top 3 fabric of gathered that added any bulk to the waistband. So it did solve somewhat that problem, and it was better, easier to gather. But it still wasn't quite right. 5 dresses down, and I have finally come to the realization that all those 6 colors and those 6 layers are not in the outer skirt, or at least the 6 colors. I have finally come to realize that. If you watched my last video about the costume breakdown part 2, where I talk about the outer skirt, you'll know that I mentioned the top layer is a silk crepe line, and then the next 2 layers are Yumissima fabric, which is extremely lightweight, so lightweight it just floats. And then we saw in this picture that those 3 fabrics are gathered separately from the iridescent nylon layer. So we obviously see that there are 2 waistbands to this skirt. We see the top one is comprised of the 3 top layers that are incredibly fine and lightweight fabrics, and thus you can get a really loosely gathered waistband without much bulk. because the skirt is also probably gored, so you don't have as much bulk at top, but you can find information in that video. But then also we see the nylon layer, and then I also brought up the possibility that there are 1 or 2 layers underneath the iridescent layer that we kind of see flipping up in some of these pictures, and it looks just like a white. So that's still maybe 6 layers to the outer skirt, but we obviously see that there are not 6 different colors in this skirt. So when Sandy mentions all these colors and even like the 12 layers, I'm pretty sure we're taking it out of context. I think when she's talking about the skirt, we're talking the entire skirt, the petticoat included. So when you think of a skirt, often you're also referring to the petticoat. You don't really make that distinction. And so this is where the lesson for this comes into play. Everything we hear from a designer or whoever worked on the dress can't always be taken at face value, because we actually don't know what they're actually talking about. We don't know if we're taking it out of context and narrowing in on this one point that they must be talking about the outer skirt when they mention skirt, but really they're just saying the skirt. So we have to be careful, and that's the lesson for this. Don't always take things at face value. You should experiment with that knowledge to see if you can take it at face value, or maybe they meant something different when they were saying it. Another point that definitely pointed that I was adding too much fabric on top of the outer skirt was the fact when I had all these different layers on top of the iridescent nylon, you could hardly even see that iridescent layer. It was very hard to get that shimmer through all those layers. And so that was one of the first clues I realized that those layers were probably not all on top, because the iridescent layer was just not visible. And then of course, seeing more up close detail shots of the skirt, you can tell that there's only 3 layers on top of that iridescent nylon. So again, don't take quotes at face value all the time. Make sure you kind of experiment with them and see if you maybe are misinterpreting what they're saying. Lesson number 6, iridescent fabrics. At first glance, these 2 fabrics look incredibly similar, but believe me, they are worlds apart. On my first 3 replicas, I used this fabric, which is iridescent Barbie organza. On my next 2, I used this fabric, which is pearlized iridescent organza. Kind of, it's named different things based on who lists it, but to me it looks very similar to what was used on the original dress. Can't be sure, but it has a very nice iridescence to it, and it's also sheer. So anyway, these are the 2 fabrics that I used. Now, what's the issue with this one, you might ask? This is the Barbie organza. After working with it for 3 dresses, the main issue with it is putting it under a sewing machine and sewing through it. It catches so much. The needle catches these little plastic fibers and puckers, like ugh, pucker, 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 pucker. Talk about puckers. But it's not my machine. I've tried completely perfect for the project, needles very smooth and sharp, and it still catches. It's just not the funnest fabric to work with. It also has a stretch, a real, really stretchy. It's just very stretchy. Whereas the pearlized organza, it still has some stretch, but way less than this stuff. So that is 2 things about the Barbie organza that I would not recommend using this. It does work well for the bodice, which we'll talk about when I go to make the bodice, but for the skirt, use this type, which it's a very smooth and iridescent, and it still puckers occasionally when the needle goes through, but not as bad as the Barbie organza. So this lesson was pretty simple. Use pearlized iridescent organza over Barbie iridescent organza. It's just a better fabric. Lesson number 7, mishmash of lessons. So this lesson is not one specific lesson. It's more of a compilation of details that I've learned the hard way sometimes on making these dresses. So first up, the too dark of fabric. With my first 3 replicas, I used silk organza for the topmost layer. Now this was a great choice, but the color of the fabric varied for each one. With the first one, I went fairly royal blue. It's pretty royal compared to the actual dress. We also know that Sandy called the color cornflower. And so I definitely went on the more royal side, and that was just a mistake on my part, not knowing really what color I was going for. But why are you bringing this up, Bella? Isn't that just color preference? I know, there is a point to this. You've got to know which dress you want to match to. Are you going for the look of the dress seen in the movie, which has been color edited to be a darker blue? Or are you going for the actual dress color, the color that you see when the dress is on display? This is a hard decision to make because everyone pretty much knows the on-the-screen color of Ella's ball gown, that striking blue. It's those of us who have seen the actual dress on display or pictures of it that now have the decision to make which one do you try to replicate. This is all up to you and your preference. And it also probably depends on why you're making your replica in the first place. So for someone who, say, wants to have a dress so that they can become a party princess and go and have all the boys and girls come up and think of you as Cinderella, you're probably going to want to go with the movie version, because as they've probably seen the movie and they haven't really seen the behind the scene pictures or on display pictures. They think of the movie because that's Cinderella. So that is something to consider, is just why are you making it? But it's really preference. It doesn't really matter except for you and your preference. But it's important to know this before you start looking at details and deciding your fabrics. Because if you decide, oh, well, I'm using all these details that are mentioned, but you're trying to achieve the on-the-screen look of the dress, then you're going to have to switch some things up to meet that criteria of looking like that on-the-screen dress. Within reason. It mainly has to do with the color of the fabric. Anyway, as I mentioned, this is just a little compilation of little tidbits of information that I've learned along the process. Stiff frills. It's not really something that you want for a petticoat, especially this petticoat, but at the same time, it kind of depends on what aspects of the dress you are wanting to replicate well versus it's not a huge deal to you. For my non-upgraded versions of this dress, I mainly used organza for the frills, with a little bit of tulle mixed in there. Since they were made of frills and not flounces, which if you missed last video where I explained the difference between frills and flounces, flounces are cut on a curved, and in this case they'd be slightly gathered, but frills are just straight pieces of fabric gathered up, and that's how you get your waviness. So my dresses have always been constructed of frills. So combination of mainly organza, which is a fairly stiff fabric, and frills. My petticoat was pretty stiff looking. It didn't really have the movement of the original dress, but mainly in regards to the frills, they just looked kind of more compact and not as curly, if that makes sense. Now on my upgraded versions, I still used frills, but I used different fabrics. I used some organza, but I mainly used nylon chiffon, which is really unique fabric. It's pretty lightweight and it has a really nice soft look to it. But nylon chiffon, I used some silk gauze and then also quite a lot of tulle. So all those fabrics I used for the frills, and on top of it, I sewed fishing line into the hems of those frills. So first thought, you're probably thinking fishing line would make your frills more stiff, right? Well, within reason it does, but at the same time it doesn't. What fishing line does in a hem is it gets this really nice curl to it. It's a stiff edge to the frill, but it curls it really nicely. So if you look at these two pictures, you can kind of tell the difference between fishing line and no fishing line. And so even though the fishing line kind of makes the frills stiffer, it was also a combination of the fact that I used these softer fabrics. It didn't have the stiffness of organza in those frills, or at least not as much of it. And so when you moved in that petticoat, you got this really soft look to all the frills. Whereas my other one, you definitely had more of a stiff looking look. So again, it's just those two different styles of frills. You can kind of look at that and what I did and see which one you like the best. So really, it's up to you. If you're making this dress and can't decide, just look, whatever you want is really, the sky's the limit. So with that lesson of little mashup of choose which dress you're trying to replicate and see what kind of frills you want to use, that kind of wraps up this video. I think I remembered most of the mistakes I made, or at least the major mistakes that I made, or should we say lessons. But that is why I'm sharing this video. I hope you can learn those things without having to make those mistakes, or if you didn't see them as mistakes, then you know you'll be fine. But I hope this video was helpful and that now you can go into your own sewing area and not make the same mistakes I did. You're probably expecting me to say, learn, create, and inspire, which is also true. But in this one, let's learn from each other's mistakes. I will have a full video coming out of all the fabrics that I am going to use in this 6th ball gown replica. I am using a couple different fabrics than I usually do, and I will talk all about that. I'll even talk about how many yards of each I purchased, just so you can get a good idea of what I'm using for the future videos of actually making the dress. Now, if you watched the last video where I kind of had a plea to help me buy Yumissima fabric, which by the way, it is pronounced Yumissima. At least I think I'm saying it right. A commenter posted a link to where you can hear Sandy Powell actually say the word, and it's Yumissima. And for those of you who also commented saying that that's probably the pronunciation, bravo to you, you were correct, and I am finally able to pronounce it correctly. So anyway, if you watch that plea of buying Yumissima fabric and finding it, I actually found an even better source for that type of fabric. It is no longer on B&J Fabrics. Even though that fabric looked like it can be a perfect substitute, I ended up hearing back from another company that I had contacted that sold a really lightweight fabric. They gave me a price quote that is better than the B&J fabric price, which I'm very excited for. I can't share what exactly I was quoted because they asked me not to, because the quote varies, especially since the exchange rate between their currency and my currency can vary, so they just didn't want any information shared about the price. But for me, it was cheaper than the B&J fabrics, which I'm so excited for because that pushed me over the edge and I am able to buy the fabric for one of the skirt layers. There's 2 skirt layers to this of that fabric, and so I am going to purchase for 1 layer. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to purchase for the second one, but if the orders for digital products and swag items and Patreon keeps coming in, I will do the leap again and go for that second layer. But a huge thank you to those patrons who have joined and all my previous ones. Just thank you so much for being a part of this journey. I appreciate it so much. And if you want to learn more about Patreon and what it's about, the link will pop up and it's down in the description below. And with that, thank you for watching. I hope it was helpful again, and now go out into your own sewing area and learn, create, and inspire.